I have handled 10,000 reports in my years in the record halls of Angband. I know what they feel like before I read them. The weight of the courier's manner when they arrive, the specific quality of urgency or routine in the way the document is presented, the smell of the road on the messenger if they have come from far away. I have developed, across centuries of this work, a sense for what a report contains before it is opened, the way a physician develops a sense for how sick a patient is before they have examined them. It is not knowledge. It is the accumulation of pattern, the long education that comes from handling enough of something that the thing begins to speak to you before it speaks. I knew this report was different the moment the courier arrived. My name is Gothrak. I am, or was, a keeper of records in the lower administrative halls of Angband, a position of no particular distinction and no particular danger, which was precisely why I had held it for as long as I had. Angband was not a place where distinction was comfortable. Distinction drew attention, and attention from Morgoth or from those who served him closely was the specific kind of attention that ended careers in ways that made the ending of a career seem fortunate in comparison to the alternative. I had survived by being useful and invisible in equal measure, by being the elf who handled the documents that needed handling and who was not remembered afterward as having handled them. I was not always what I am now. I had been something else before Angband made me what I became. Something I do not think about, if I can help it. Something that exists in my memory in fragments, rather than as a continuous thing, the way a language you have not spoken for centuries exists in fragments. It is enough to say that I had been in Angband long enough that the distinction between what I had been and what I was had become, for practical purposes, meaningless. The work of the record halls was the only work I knew with any clarity. The life of those halls was the only life I had any clear memory of choosing, insofar as anything in Angband was chosen. I handled the reports that came in from the field, from the spies and the agents and the creatures Morgoth kept in the world outside Angband to watch the movements of his enemies and report what they saw. Most of these reports were routine: troop positions, supply lines, the movements of the free peoples, the specific intelligence that an army in the field needs about the territory it intends to operate in. I read thousands of them across the centuries, and I remember almost none of them, because almost none of them contained anything that required remembering. Some did. The reports about Turin I remembered from the first one. The first report was brief: a man in Doriath, of the house of Hador, son of Hurin of Dorlomin. The name Hurin was flagged in our records as significant, one of the men who had been taken after the Nirnath and who had been dealt with personally by Morgoth in a way that generated its own category of documentation. A son of Hurin entering Doriath was the kind of information that moved quickly up the chain of attention. I filed it and thought nothing more about it. The second report was longer. The son of Hurin had killed a man in Doriath, had fled, was living as an outlaw in the forests outside the kingdom's protection, leading a band of men who were building a reputation for a specific kind of violence that the field agents described with the care of people who wanted to be accurate without being the ones responsible for what they were describing. I read the report and noted the flag and sent it where it needed to go. I began to notice that the reports about this man were being read more carefully than most. The outlaw years generated a particular volume of documentation, more than I would have expected for a single man with a small band operating in forest territory. The agents tracked him with the persistence of a monitoring operation rather than simple intelligence gathering, which itself told me something about how he was being categorized at levels above my own. Field monitoring of this intensity was reserved for subjects considered either strategically significant or personally significant to those making the determination. And I had enough experience to know the difference between the two. He moved through the forests south of Doriath for years, leading a band that grew and shrank and grew again, acquiring the specific reputation of someone whose capacity for violence was matched by an equally specific capacity for suffering. The reports described losses he absorbed that would have broken most men and most bands. Companions killed, positions overrun, alliances broken by the specific bad fortune that seemed to attach itself to his enterprises with a consistency that the agents noted as remarkable, not because bad fortune was unusual in that world, but because the concentration of it in the affairs of one man across many years was statistically unusual enough to warrant the notation. He survived it all. He kept moving. He kept fighting. The band around him changed, but he persisted at its center with the quality of something that the world kept trying to resolve and kept failing to resolve. Not by me, by the people above me, the ones who received my summaries and decided what reached Morgoth and what did not. I could tell by the questions that came back, the requests for additional detail, the specific follow-up inquiries that indicated someone at a level I didn't have direct access to was paying close attention to a man in the forests outside Doriath who was making his way through the world in a manner that had apparently attracted notice. I filed this observation alongside the reports and said nothing about it. The years passed, and the reports continued, and the man in them grew. He came to Nargothrond. This I remember clearly, because the report that described his arrival and his subsequent position in that kingdom was the longest single field document I had processed up to that point, detailed in a way that field reports rarely were, as though the agent who wrote it had understood that what they were describing was worth the extra pages. He had become, in Nargothrond, something between an advisor and a commander, a man whose counsel had reshaped how that kingdom conducted its defense, and whose presence on the field had changed what the field meant for the forces that faced him. The specific change he made to Nargothrond's strategy was documented carefully because its consequences were significant. The kingdom had previously operated under a policy of concealment, relying on the secrecy of its location and its tunnels for protection, avoiding open engagement. He had argued against this. He had persuaded the king, or those around the king, that concealment was a form of defeat, that a hidden people was already a diminished people, and that the forces of Nargothrond were capable of meeting the enemy in the field and winning. He was right about the capability. He was not right about what the enemy would eventually send against them. I noted this distinction in my own thinking and set it aside, because it was not my function to assess the strategic reasoning of Morgoth's enemies. My function was to document and file. I documented it. I filed it. I thought about it privately across the following years as the reports from the field around Nargothrond continued to arrive and the picture they assembled continued to develop. The agents gave him a name. They called him the Black Sword of the North. I read this in the report, and I read it again, and I noted that the field agents, who were not in the habit of giving names to individual men, had given this one a name, and I noted what that meant about what he was becoming in the world outside Angband. I filed the report. I did not file the observation. Some observations it was safer to make only to yourself. The sword itself appeared in the reports around this time, first as a detail, and then as something more than a detail. A black blade, taken in circumstances the reports described with some uncertainty. a weapon whose history was obscure, but whose effect on the field was not obscure at all. The agents wrote about it the way soldiers write about something they have seen in the field and cannot fully account for, with the specific combination of precision and unease that comes from trying to describe something accurately while being uncertain whether accuracy is sufficient. I read those passages more carefully than I read most things. There was something in the reports about the sword that I could not categorize. I had a category for weapons that were simply well made. I had a category for weapons that carried enchantment, that had been made with specific power woven into them by those who understood such making. Fredae, Black Blade did not fit either category cleanly. The agents described men dying to it who should not have died to any blade, not because of the skill of the man wielding it, though that skill was considerable, but because of something in the blade itself, some quality that the reports struggled to name, and that I, reading them, also struggled to name. The sword had a history that the agents had worked to reconstruct. It had been made from a fragment of a blade called Anglachel, itself a weapon of dark reputation, made from iron that had fallen from the sky and forged by a smith whose relationship to darkness was documented in our own records, in ways I will not detail here. The blade had been reforged by Turin himself, or remade under his direction, and in the remaking it had been given a name, Gurthang, the Iron of Death. I had processed documentation on named weapons before. Named weapons were not unusual in that age. What was unusual was the specific nature of the reports about this one, which described it less as a tool in its wielder's hand, and more as something that participated in what its wielder was doing. An agent had written, with the obvious discomfort of a professional trying to remain professional while describing something that resisted professional description, that in the engagement they had observed, the blade had seemed to move with a purpose that was not entirely reducible to the purpose of the man holding it. What I settled on, in the privacy of my own thinking, was this. The blade seemed to want what its wielder wanted. I kept this thought to myself with some care. There were things in Angband that it was inadvisable to articulate, and a sword with a will of its own was one of them, because the implications of that, followed to their conclusion, were not implications that anyone in a record hall would want to be known to have followed. There were perhaps 12 years between the first report and the fall of Nargothrond. In those 12 years, I processed more documentation about a single man than I had processed about any other individual in my time in the record halls. He was not the most powerful being the field agents had ever reported on. He commanded no great army. He had no political authority beyond what he had carved out by the specific quality of his presence and his ability. By any conventional measure of what made a person significant in the wars of that age, he was not the most significant person I had documented. And yet, there was something in the accumulated weight of those reports, read across 12 years, that produced an understanding I could not have arrived at from any single one of them. The understanding was not tactical. It was not about what he could do on a battlefield or what forces he could bring to bear or what strategic value he represented to the free peoples. It was something more personal than that, and more unsettling. The man the reports described was a man who had nothing left to lose. I want to be precise about what I mean by this because it is the center of everything that follows. Morgoth's power in the world operated through a specific mechanism. He found what things valued, and he threatened it, or destroyed it, or used it as leverage. Fear was his instrument, and fear required something to threaten. The men and elves who faced him in the world outside Angband feared for their lives, for their people, for the things they had built and loved, for the futures they had imagined for themselves. This fear was what Morgoth used. It was what made his curse on Hurin so elegant, in the specific, cruel elegance of Morgoth's designs, because it did not just threaten Turin, but used Turin's own capacity for love and loyalty as the mechanism of destruction. What the reports described, accumulating across 12 years, was a man from whom the mechanism had been progressively stripped. He had lost Doriath. He had lost the outlaw years. He had lost companions and friends and people he had tried to protect and failed to protect. He had lost his identity more than once, had lived under names that were not his own in places that did not know his history, and each time the history had caught up with him and the loss had resumed. Morgoth's curse was working exactly as designed. Turin was being destroyed, but the destruction was producing something Morgoth had not designed for. A man from whom everything can be taken is a man who cannot be threatened. And a man who cannot be threatened is a man whose behavior cannot be predicted by an intelligence that operates through threat. Morgoth understood power. He understood it in every form it took in the world, understood how to apply it, and how to counter it, and how to use it as leverage. What he was less equipped to understand, I came to believe in the privacy of my record hall, was the specific kind of freedom that comes from having nothing left. I came to believe this because of what I observed in the years when the reports about Turin were at their most detailed. I observed that the requests for additional information, the follow-up inquiries, the questions that came down from above about this man and his sword and his movements changed in quality around the 7th or 8th year of the reports. In the early years, the questions had the quality of tactical intelligence gathering. Where is he? What forces does he command? What are his likely movements? These were the questions of a military intelligence operation monitoring a potential threat. In the later years, the questions had a different quality. They were more careful, more specific about things that were not tactical. What did he say? How did he behave in this situation? What did the men around him do when he did this thing? These were not the questions of someone building a tactical picture. These were the questions of someone trying to understand what they were dealing with. And there is a difference between those two things that I had spent enough years in the record halls to recognize. The difference is this. You gather tactical intelligence about enemies you know how to fight. You gather the other kind about enemies you are uncertain how to fight. I had been in the record halls through engagements with many enemies. I had processed the documentation of campaigns against kingdoms and heroes and armies of considerable power. I knew what the intelligence operation looked like when Angband was confident. The questions were tactical, the planning was direct. The operations that followed moved against the enemy's actual position rather than around the edges of it. What the documentation of the later Turin years looked like was something I had seen only a handful of times in my career, and in each previous case, the subject of the documentation had been something that Angband had genuine reason to be cautious about. A specific combination of power and unpredictability that made direct engagement more costly than indirect management. The documentation of those cases had a careful quality, a deliberateness in the phrasing of requests, and the precision of the follow-up questions that reflected an operation being run by someone who understood that a mistake would not be easily corrected. The Turin documentation had that quality. I noted this. I filed it where I filed the things I noticed and did not say. Nargothrond fell. The report was long and detailed, and the field agents who wrote it conveyed, in the specific way of field agents who are trying to remain professional while describing something that had disturbed them, that the fall had been comprehensive. The kingdom was gone. The people were taken or dead. Glaurung had done what Glaurung was sent to do, and Turin Turambar had stood at the gates of the fallen city and faced Glaurung directly. I read this part of the report 3 times, not because I doubted it, because I wanted to understand it. A man, standing at the gates of a city that had just fallen, facing the creature responsible for its fall, and the creature had used its gaze to freeze him rather than simply killing him, which was the thing a creature like Glaurung didn't do if it didn't have a reason. And the reason, reading between the lines of a field report that was being carefully professional about what it described, appeared to be that killing him directly was not straightforwardly available as an option. I filed this report with a notation that it required direct attention from above. The answer that came back was brief. I was to compile a complete summary of all documentation relating to Turin, son of Hurin, and have it prepared within 3 days. In 30 years of record-keeping, I had never been asked to compile a complete summary of documentation on any individual. The request itself was a kind of report. I spent 3 days reading everything we had, every field report, every follow-up inquiry, every notation and addendum and supplementary observation that had been attached across the years. There was more of it than I had realized. When you handle documents individually, processing each one and filing it and moving to the next, you do not accumulate a sense of the total. Reading it all in sequence across 3 days was a different experience. It was the experience of watching a life from the outside across 12 years, watching someone move through the world in the way that only an intelligence operation sees, stripped of the interpretation that proximity provides, and left with only the facts and the gaps between them. The facts were remarkable enough. The gaps were more remarkable. There were periods in the documentation where the reports became sparse or uncertain, where the agents had lost track of him, or where what he was doing was not amenable to the kind of documentation an agent produced. During these periods, the follow-up inquiries from above intensified rather than easing, which was itself a document of sorts. The silence about his movements produced more questions than the reports did. I read it all in sequence, and then I read it again, and by the end of the second reading, I had arrived at the understanding I have been attempting to describe. The curse had worked. Turin had been destroyed, progressively and thoroughly, in exactly the way Morgoth had designed, and the destruction had produced a man who was, in some specific and important sense, beyond the reach of the mechanisms that had destroyed him. Because the mechanisms required something to threaten, and there was nothing left. I sat with this understanding for a long time before I compiled the summary. Not because I was uncertain about the understanding, because I was uncertain about what to do with it. The summary I had been asked to produce was a summary of facts, of documented events, of the intelligence that had been gathered and filed across 12 years. I was not asked for an analysis. I was not asked for an interpretation. I was asked for a compilation. But a compilation without interpretation is just a list, and a list of the events of Turin's life, read in sequence without the thread that connected them, would not convey what 12 years of reading those documents one at a time had conveyed to me, which was that the thread itself was the significant thing. That what the documents described, taken individually, was a series of misfortunes. That what they described, taken together, was a process, and the product of the process was what I believed was now being asked about at levels above my own. I included the facts. I included the sequence. I included, in language as careful as I could to make it, a note at the end of the compilation that the subject of the documentation had, in the assessment of the compiler, undergone a change in the most recent years of the period under review that was not fully captured by the individual reports, but that was visible in the accumulated record. That the man described in the early reports and the man described in the most recent reports were connected by continuity of identity, but separated by a distance that the compiler believed was relevant to whatever purpose the summary was intended to serve. I didn't say what I believed the distance consisted of. I was not certain that saying it directly was something I could do safely. I compiled the summary. I delivered it. I returned to my record hall, and I waited. The next months were quiet in the way that things are quiet in Angband when something is being decided at a level that does not generate documentation. The business of the record halls continued. Reports came in from the field and were processed and filed. The ordinary administration of a large military operation proceeded as it always proceeded. On the surface of things, nothing had changed. Underneath the surface of things, something had changed. I could feel it in the quality of the instructions that came down, in the specific way that the field operations against the forest of Brethil, where Turin had gone after Nargothrond, were conducted. They were not the operations of a military power pursuing an enemy. They were more careful than that, more indirect. They operated at the edges of the territory rather than through the center of it, through proxies and through the manipulation of other forces rather than through direct engagement. I will be specific about what this looked like in the documentation, because the specificity matters. The reports from the Brethil period described the movements of creatures and agents around the borders of the forest, watching and reporting, but not entering. Instructions that came down authorized surveillance, but not engagement. When the people of Brethil skirmished with the things watching their borders, the response was withdrawal rather than escalation, a pattern of behavior that, in any other context, I would have identified immediately as the behavior of something that did not want to provoke the thing it was watching. There was also a pattern in what the reports did not describe. In previous campaigns, the documentation would include assessments of the target's vulnerabilities, recommended approaches, projected force requirements. The Brethil reports did not include these assessments. I processed them and I noticed their absence, and I did not annotate the absence, because annotating the absence was not something I was going to do. I had been in the record halls long enough to know what direct engagement looked like in the documentation and what avoidance looked like in the documentation. The documentation of the Brethil years looked like avoidance. I noted this. I said nothing. Then the report came. I knew it before the courier arrived. I have said this about other reports, and I want to be precise about what I mean, because this time it was different in kind rather than degree. The courier who brought this report had the specific quality of someone who had carried something across a very long distance very quickly, and who had understood, in carrying it, that what they carried was important in a way that went beyond the ordinary importance of field intelligence. They presented the document with the care of someone who wanted to be certain the presentation was correct, who wanted there to be no ambiguity about who had delivered it and when. I received it. I looked at the seal. I broke it and read what was inside. The report was not long. Field reports of genuine significance are often not long. The significant thing had happened. The significant thing was simple enough in its facts, if not in its meaning, and the agent who wrote the report had understood that clarity was what was required. Turin Turambar was dead. He had gone to the creature Glaurung, who had been sent against the people of Brethil, and he had found it at a ravine called Kabed en Aras, and he had killed it, the greatest dragon Morgoth had made, the first of his kind, the father of all the fireworms that had broken armies and burned kingdoms and separated the forces of Fingon and Medros at the Nirneth, killed by a single man with a black blade at a river crossing in a forest. The agent described this in the careful professional language of field reporting, which meant that the words were flat and the thing they described was not flat, and the gap between the words and the thing was its own kind of document. Then Turin had spoken to the blade. The report was precise about this. He had spoken to it. He had called it by name, Gurthang, the Iron of Death, the name he had given it, and he had asked it to kill him, and the agent reported that the blade had answered. Not that it had been used, that it had answered, that there had been something in the exchange between the man and the weapon that the agent had described, with the specific unease of a professional trying to remain professional, as a conversation rather than a use. The blade had killed him. At his request. By his will. I read the report twice. I noted the details. I sealed it in the summary cover that protocol required for reports of this classification, and I carried it up through the levels of Angband that I was permitted to move through, and I delivered it to the chamber that received reports of this kind. I did not see Morgoth receive it. My position did not grant me that access, and I would not have sought it. But I had been in the record halls long enough to understand how information moved through Angband, and what the movement of information meant, and in the days that followed the delivery of that report, I observed things that I have thought about ever since. The operations against Brethil ceased, not wound down, ceased. The documentation that had been accumulating about Turin, the follow-up requests, the additional inquiries, the careful attention from above that had been a feature of my record-keeping for 12 years, also ceased, not filed away or marked complete, simply stopped generating, as though the subject of the documentation had been closed in a way that made further documentation unnecessary. And there was one other thing, which I observed once, and only once, and which I have been careful about describing, because I am aware that what I believe I observed and what I can demonstrate I observed are not the same thing. I was in a corridor of the upper administrative levels, delivering a routine summary, when I passed within sight of a room I was not supposed to be near. The door was not fully closed. I did not stop. I did not look directly. But I have been reading the specific quality of attention in the beings around me for a very long time, and what I registered in the fragment of a moment that I was within range of that room was not rage and was not satisfaction, and was not the specific cold calculation that was Morgoth's most common register in the reports his subordinates produced about his reactions to events in the world. What I registered was something I didn't have a word for until I had thought about it for a long time. The closest I can come to it is this. It was the quality of a being that has wanted something to end for a very long time, and has found that the ending, when it came, did not feel the way it expected. Something had been resolved, and the resolution was not what had been intended, and knowing that the specific threat was gone did not produce the satisfaction that removing a threat was supposed to produce. I thought about this across the years that followed. I thought about it alongside everything I had observed in 12 years of handling the reports, alongside the change in the quality of the inquiries, alongside the indirect operations in Brethil that looked like avoidance, alongside the blade that the report said had answered when spoken to. I arrived, in the end, at the same place I had arrived at many times in smaller ways across a life spent in the record halls, which is that the most important things are often in the gaps between the documents, rather than in the documents themselves. in what was not said, in what was asked, in a way that revealed more than the asking was meant to reveal, in the quality of a silence that follows a piece of information in someone who had been waiting for that information for a long time. Morgoth had cursed Turin to destroy him. The destruction had been accomplished. The man was dead, and the sword was silent, and the name that the field agents had given him, the Black Sword of the North, would belong to no one now. And the being who had designed the destruction, who had watched it proceed across decades, who had built it from the grief of a father, kept alive on a mountainside specifically to witness it, had received the news of its completion with the specific quality of a thing that had not gone as planned. I noted this in the record I kept only for myself, the one that existed in no filing system and would survive in no archive. He had feared him. Not the sword, though the sword had been part of it. Not the deeds, though the deeds had been extraordinary. The specific thing that Morgoth had feared was the thing I had watched accumulate in those 12 years of reports. The slow, terrible clarification of a man who had lost everything that could be lost and had become, in the losing, something that could not be threatened. You cannot curse a man into that. You cannot design for it. The instrument of the curse had developed, through the curse itself, the one quality that the curse-maker had no answer for. It was the only time in my years in the record halls that I filed something I had observed and felt that the observation was complete. The ones who write history write about what he accomplished, the dragon he killed, the kingdoms he walked through, the sword that answered when he spoke to it. These things are in the histories, and they are true, and they are remarkable. But they are not what made Morgoth afraid of him. Remarkable men had accomplished remarkable things before, and would accomplish them again. And Morgoth was not afraid of remarkable men. He was the architect of remarkable men's suffering. That was his instrument, and he was practiced in its use. What he had not been prepared for was a man who had been through the instrument and come out the other side of it, who had been shaped by the suffering into something the suffering could no longer reach, who carried a sword that apparently agreed with him about what needed to happen. I have thought about this for a very long time. I am still thinking about it. It was the only time I was certain I had understood what I had seen,